Okay, so I think we'll make a start because we have 48 people in attendance, and there might be some more people joining. Welcome to Cardiff Book Talk. I'm Anna Mercer. I'm a lecturer at Cardiff, and I've been working on coordinating these events with the Book Talk team this year. This is our third online session, as I mentioned, and this is our first author-led session of the season on Richard Gwyn's The Blue Tent, which we're very much looking forward to discussing this evening. Just to note that you should head to cardiffbooktalk.org, our website, to see the full list of forthcoming events, including next up on the 17th of February, Susan M. Gaines's Accidentals, and then on the 3rd of March, Octavia Butler's Kindred. Recordings of our past online events on Shirley Jackson and Jane Austen can also be found on YouTube, so you can catch up. And this is being recorded too, so this will also be shared to a wide audience. You can also head to our blog and social media for more content on the authors we discuss here at Book Talk. Do please get in touch with any feedback you have. This is the first time we've been online. So as with many other people running events at the moment, we are trying it out and we hope you appreciate and enjoy it. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to pass over now to Dr. Christie Collins, who is a creative writer at Cardiff, who will be introducing and interviewing Richard for us today. Remember to get your own questions ready for the Q&A and put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen at any time. Okay, over to you, Christie.
Thank you, Anna. So just to introduce Richard, for those of you who don't already know him, he was born in Pontypool and raised in Crickhowell. Both of those are in Wales, if you don't know the area. He is presently a professor at Cardiff University in creative and critical writing. He's also one of the few writers who I feel can essentially do it all, be it fiction, nonfiction, or poetry, and whether in the narrative or lyrical mode. He's got equal skill in everything, really, which is amazing. His memoir, The Vagabond's Breakfast, won the 2012 Wells Book of the Year. Here to talk about and read from his novel, The Blue Tent, is Richard Gwyn.
Good evening. I can't see you, but I know that you're there. I'm going to start by reading from the opening of The Blue Tent. I stand by the kitchen window, staring at a blue tent. It is pitched just beyond my garden fence in Morgan's Field. The tent is bothering me. It is too near the house, too close for comfort. There is no sign of a car or any other vehicle in the field, nor in the drive that leads to my house. Whoever owns the tent must have arrived by foot. They are well off the beaten track. I step out into pale sunshine, and the air quivers with birdsong. To one side of the house lie steep woods, burgeoning green, and a buzzard hovers high above the trees, a speck in the pristine sky. I wander down the drive to make sure no vehicle is parked on the verge, hidden by the hedgerow. Behind me, the house presents an imposing facade, the 3 upstairs windows forming a dark triptych, giving the impression of symmetry and substance. Walking back into the garden, I come to a stop beside a tangle of rose bushes. From here, I have an unobstructed view of the tent huddled close to my house, as if taking advantage of the shelter and security that such a solid building provides. What a foolish presumption. How can the occupant or occupants of the tent know that the house is not inhabited by a dangerous lunatic, some deranged rustic assassin? Why on earth do they imagine that they are safe? Lord knows, I have an axe. If I were to pitch a tent in a field while on a camping holiday, I would pick a spot further away from the only building in this part of the valley. under the big oak in the middle of the field, perhaps, or beside the stream that runs alongside it, but not at the edge of someone's garden, practically under the eaves of their house. There is, after all, a lot of land out there, a great deal of green land. Why so close? I think that'll do.
Hello, were you ready for some questions, Richard?
Yeah, certainly.
Excellent. My first question having to do with genre. I was thinking as you were just reading that about how when I read this, I was thinking about how I think it's the first 60 or 70 pages or so could effectively be considered realism. I mean, basically everything that's noted could happen. And then there's this shift where you start to realize that we're not quite in the world that we know. So just right on that, as I was reading it, I was trying to define it, to which maybe I shouldn't always be trying to do, but I was trying to locate it. You know, should I be calling this magical realism? Should I be calling this uncanny realism? So I wanted to ask you, where would you locate this novel, if anywhere? And does that question even matter? Does it matter what kind of genre that the novel might fit into?
Well, it's a kind of question that I dread answering, really, because a writer doesn't really set out, unless they are specifically a genre writer and are writing a detective novel or a horror story or whatever. Genre isn't something that has ever actually bothered me, and I know that I'm writing within a context, and I'm writing within a historical continuum, if you like, of the novel, and realism is the dominant accepted mode in which we read novels nowadays, I suppose, for the most part. But the idea that I was trying to unravel was the one that occurred to me, the story of the tent. And I wasn't quite sure what the tent was doing there. It seemed quite a reasonable thing for the guy to see from his window. But it occurred to me as I was writing, I had no idea where the tent came from. I had no idea what I was trying to remember before this talk. When did I first think of the tent? And I've got no idea. It just appeared. And then as it lingered there and I didn't know what to do with it, it suddenly began to take over this life of its own, and it turned into a different sort of story altogether. And I kind of suspected that was going to happen, but because I didn't have a plan, I didn't have a genre. You can't have a genre without a plan. So I do find it quite an interesting question now, because it is one that gets raised quite a lot with not just this novel, but other novels of mine. And magical realism, of course, is when, the everyday, when the everyday and the magical become kind of inverted, and those things which we would normally consider quotidian and expected, where the magical is expected and the normal is not. So it's a kind of inversion.
I feel like also with magical realism, basically we're in the world that we know. It's just that world is kind of being redefined by whatever kind of magical element is being shown to us. Whereas in your novel, not to give anything away, but you start to kind of question what's real and what's not, and what can be believed and what can't. And so we kind of end the novel with those questions still in place. So I think that alone kind of puts it into a different genre.
Yeah, and of course that's, you know, that's transmitted to us through the narrator, who is you know, unreliably unreliable, in the sense, you know, the distinction that James Wood makes about, you know, the reliable unreliable narrator, in that you know that he's unreliable, and then the more tricky question of the unreliable narrator, in which that sense of dislocation becomes more apparent as the story continues.
Absolutely. And you mentioned when we spoke before about a type of genre that was, is it called dreamlike fiction? What's that?
Homeric fiction. Yeah, this was fairly new one to me too. Yes. I think I know exactly what that is, and it ties in with a lot of writing that, you know, I can trace back to certain people, including Stevenson and De Quincey, but more in my case with writers much further back in the past, and specifically in the Celtic cycles, such as the Mabinogion. And you know, my writings always kind of had roots in that mythological past, and I find that I, in a sense, draw on it more, perhaps not so consciously, but certainly more than I do on the genre of magic realism.
Excellent. So to move along to, so the novel quite obviously references Borges, and specifically his story, the Aleph, as I always said, and I think that you said Aleph earlier, so however you might say it. I was wondering if you could discuss a bit about Borges's influence on both you and the novel.
Yeah. Well, I've always been, well, since the age of about 18, I've read Borges, and I guess, you know, it's tricky talking about influences because you feel like you're giving something away. There's an interview with Max Zibold where he confesses to the influence of Thomas Bernhard, and says that he doesn't really like talking about Bernhard because he hoped that people wouldn't notice that he was an influence. But I'm afraid I've blown it here because the whole book's kind of reeks of Borges. And I didn't just lift the idea of the Aleph from him, but I've kind of switched it, as Colin Bond pointed out in a piece he wrote for the blog. In Borges's version of the Aleph, the narrator in the story goes to this house where his beloved, or rather the woman he worshipped from afar, used to live, and she's died, and the house is inhabited by her cousin, who's a fairly kind of repulsive and inflated character who the narrator despises. He's an epic poet, and his surname, strangely, is Argentino, which of course means Argentine. So I don't know what Borges was trying to say with that surname. Anyway, it's in the cellar of this house that he finds the Aleph. And the Aleph contains everything in the universe, everything in the known world, rather. And the Aleph in this novel, in The Blue Tent, has a kind of quantum spin on it because it contains all possible worlds. And I hadn't really taken in that this was a major difference until I read Colin's article. but in fact, it's quite a significant spin, because that adds the kind of element of the multiverse to the novel, which kind of makes itself slightly more apparent without giving too much away as the novel continues.
The Aleph in the Borges story is it's just kind of on the wall, isn't it? It's kind of just this like portal.
Yeah.
And you already do something different because it's like a handheld device. I mean, not like a cell phone, but like just a thing that they can actually be held, right? So that's a bit different.
Yeah, and there's obviously kind of some reference there to the mobile phone, which many readers have spotted. In fact, one of the first readers of the book read it on his phone, because I sent it to him, and he was scrolling down the book on his phone, and then got to the bit about the Aleph and realized that he was reading about an Aleph on an Aleph, the Aleph for our times. But of course, I did find that the influence of Borges didn't weigh too heavy, because the Aleph is only an element within the story, and the correspondence that it bears to the blue tent only becomes apparent, further on in the tale, when the character who first finds it exchanges it for the tent. And I think that the discovery of the Aleph was something that I didn't go into in great detail in the novel, but I think I was fascinated by the idea that you might be doing something very banal, like working in a field as he was, in the late summer in the south of France, where the maize grows. The male plants have to be castrated, which means plucking off part of the top of the plant so that it can't fertilize the female plants and create what the French delicately call bastards. This is all kind of agricultural talk that went over my head when I was working in the maize fields myself in my mid-20s. But O'Halloran, the character in the novel, stubs his toe on something when he's in the field, and he thinks it's a stone. But in fact, it's this object that represents everything that's ever happened in this universe and all known universes. And I thought, this would be quite a thing, really, wouldn't it? If you're going about your daily business and you suddenly have an encounter with the infinite. So I thought I'd keep it in.
He does give it up a bit easily, I thought. But that's okay. So my third question had to do with the setting of the novel, which was my personal favorite part. It really added a lot to the novel for me, I think, to have it kind of what could be a international reaching story, but kind of set in the Welsh landscape. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the importance and significance of the setting in this novel.
Yeah, the novel takes place in the US Valley, or better known as the Llantoni Valley, which runs essentially between Abergavenny and Hay-on-Wye. It passes through the village, the hamlet of Llantoni and Capel Fyn. And this is an area close to where I grew up, and it was almost, there's 4 valleys within the Black Mountains and 5 fingers of the mountains over that surround those valleys. And this is the kind of second valley to the west, to the east, sorry. And there was a friary founded there in, I think, about the 11th century, and around that area is where the house is located, between there and Cwmioe, which is another village in the valley further down. And I always had a very strong sense of identity with this place. You know how sometimes places become particularly significant, and I think that the place in this novel is very much a character within it, because it could only be located there in my mind.
Mm.
But it's also the place where the protagonist's aunt lived, and successive generations of her family. And this sense of continuity that inhabits the house, and which he feels a part of, which goes back at least to, you know, the 17th century and the alchemists of the area, of which, you know, to cut a long story short, he is essentially descended, correlates in some way to my sense of continuity within community and within family, and that I feel very much a part of that landscape. So it's fitting that it should be a central part of the story.
Excellent. Yeah, I think I mentioned to you as well that I felt like, of course, this story could have really taken place anywhere. I mean, it's possible, but I felt like it was really important that the whole thing happened in a more like, you know, rural area, to a character that's not really, even though he's integrated in the area because his family is from there, he doesn't really have very much community. And that's what almost kind of allowed him to be caught up in everything that's happening. Would you agree? Could this have happened in a city setting?
Definitely not. No, it's, I mean, the protagonist himself is kind of a displaced person in many ways, and is rootless, and has spent, well, we don't really know, but he's spent much of his life traveling and writing fake guides to places, which I thought was quite significant in some ways. But I can't imagine the story taking place anywhere else. Not so much because of him, the central protagonist, but because of the other people, and especially his aunt, Megan, who was the owner, who was the maker of the tent, or so we're told. Whether we believe that or not, or whether it's important that she was the maker of the tent, is an element which isn't really explored. But all the people who own the tent or claim to own the tent said that they were given it by her.
Absolutely. And the fact that that's not really explored, in addition to the fact that I think you mentioned in an interview that you thought about doing a series. I don't know if it was based on this same idea, but is that something that could be explored in kind of future editions of the same storyline?
Oh, most definitely. Though the whether or not it'll specifically concern the tent is another matter. Originally, I envisaged the novel as being in three voices: in the protagonist's voice, in Megan's voice, and in Alice's voice. But I shed quite a lot of the book and thought that I would keep it for another day, and see how this one went, and possibly continue in a slightly different vein. Raymond Williams, the great Welsh cultural theorist and novelist, wrote, or began to write, a trilogy called the Black Mountains trilogy, but he died after the pre-final draft of the second volume. And I thought it would be quite nice, though, you know, not that I'm comparing myself with Raymond Williams, but it'd be quite nice to do something similar about the Black Mountains as a celebration of that area. So I'm not sure, but there's certainly more to be said around this kind of general theme and related to this story.
Awesome. And just one final question. getting back to the idea of genre, did you always know that this was going to be a novel, or did it start as maybe a short story idea? And kind of a second part onto that, when you have an idea, does it ever move around on you? Maybe you think it's going to be a poem, but then it ends up being nonfiction. Just a bit about your process, really.
Oh, okay. No, this was always going to be a novel. I actually started writing it at the same time that I was writing The Vagabond's Breakfast, which is memoir or nonfiction. And I was writing them concurrently. And at one point I had the rather ridiculous idea of joining them up and making them into a single creature. But I had no idea why I thought that might work, but it didn't. And thank God I gave up the notion that it might. But it was always going to be a novel, and I think that decision is something that I probably have a very clear idea about before I set out. If I have an idea, I know what language, what rhythm, what genre, if you like, it belongs in.
Awesome. Well, I think that you were going to do a second reading before Colin Bond.
Yeah, if I may. I was going to read a short passage, having mentioned the Aleph. The Aleph is discovered by this character called O'Halloran, who turns up at the protagonist's house, having parked his tent in the garden or at the end of the garden. He's not made particularly welcome, and he's interrogated at length by the protagonist, who wants to know about the tent, and in order to tell him about the tent, he has first to tell him about the Aleph, which, as I've said, he discovered in a maize field, and became quickly aware of its magical properties. And this is what happened to him after a couple of days of owning the Aleph. For the first few days, I was over the moon. I was master of the universe, and I shared my find with my friends, allowing them to glimpse its wonders. But then gradually, over the following 2 weeks, I became defensive about the thing and guarded it jealously. I descended into a terrible depression. I stopped speaking. At least I stopped speaking to anyone or anything other than the silver cylinder, to which I murmured softly, as to a lover. My friends could no longer tolerate me, and they left. Zoff and Lucas tried to talk me into coming with them. They were off to Spain with their earnings for a beach holiday, but I knew that they were all consumed with envy and just pretending to be nice, and that really all 4 of them were sick to death of me. I knew that for sure. I spent all my time consulting my cylindrical treasure, watching the events of history unfold within its small yet infinite space, marveling at the revelation of things to come and of things that might have been. For it soon became apparent that the wonderful object contained all possible stories, and not only those that took place, as it were, in actual fact. However, what the magical object could not do, which differentiated it from some kind of genie or oracle, was inform me about my present circumstances, or enable me to act on the information it provided. It could show me outcomes, but I had nothing to trace them back to, if you see what I mean. No way of telling whether its projections of the future were any more reliable than its representations of the past. It mixed facts with fiction. It showered me with images of every kind. Thus I could see the world, for instance, from the point of view of Roger the Gimp, who spent each morning sipping his armagnac while gazing at Mimi's cleavage, could witness the infidelities of the town rugby team's coach, Jean-Pierre, participate in the bizarre existential inquiries of the postwoman, Aurélie, share in the dreadful fear of death that tormented the school caretaker, Frédéric, recoil at the paedophilic fancies of old Pan, the pâtissier. But were these things real or merely reflections cast up by the imaginings of these protagonists? I must confess, the magical screen often seemed to home in on truly vile and ugly things, unless that's what it found most salient about human beings, or unless it adjusted its revelations to suit the mind of the voyeur, a possibility that would not reflect well on me, I'm afraid. And though I could see all these things and more, I was impotent to change any of it. It permitted only a detached observer. At the slightest inclination of the observer to take action, the screen, as it were, went blank. It knew, you see. It could read my mind.
Thank you so much for both of your readings, Richard. I will turn you over to Colin Bond now, who will give you some questions from our audience.
Thank you for that. That was great. There's some really good questions coming in. Just before we do go to that, could you say I just wanted you to expand on something that you mentioned just now about the fact that the narrator of the story has this backstory that he writes fake guidebooks, which seems to me a very sort of Borgesian profession, but you were saying that seemed to you significant. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, it kind of fits into the whole theme of, what is authentic and what is not. And the fact that it doesn't seem to bother the protagonist should probably be a clue. While he presents it as a kind of, he presents it in a very offhand way, if I remember rightly. He doesn't really consider it to be a deception, because he's fairly disdainful of the people he's writing the guides for in the first place. And that's fairly typical of his character, I think.
I think it's not unusual in the actual guidebook profession either, is it?
I'm sure it's not.
Yeah.
I've encountered many a fictional guidebook in places where I've actually needed one that might have been a bit more reliable.
Okay. The first question that we had from Jamie Woods, he says, he remembers you talking about the Blue Tent in 2013. How long have you been working on the novel?
I started working on it in about 2007. And it went through various forms and shapes, and as I mentioned when I was talking to Christie, it was at one point going to be a bigger book which included the voices of Megan and Alice, and then I abandoned it around the time that Jamie is talking about, I think 2012, 2013. I gave it up. I didn't throw it away, however. And I came back to it about 5 years later and decided that there was life in the thing yet. So I thought I'd finish it, and I grew to like it again, which is quite important.
Okay. A question from Lloyd. He asks, insomnia is a recurrent detail in your writing. You discuss it in The Vagabond's Breakfast. And you have a poem called Episodic Insomnia. How has insomnia shaped your creative process? And in what ways, if any, do you draw from your dream life when you're writing fiction?
Well, my dream life is pretty scant, to be honest, because I don't sleep much. But also, this is quite frustrating because when I I very much want to dream, and occasionally I have dreams which do feed into my writing, but not as much as I would have liked. And I think this is quite common, not just amongst insomniacs, because obviously you do sleep occasionally, but amongst writers. I've talked to quite a lot of writers who don't seem to dream much, and I think it's possible that the stuff kind of gets channeled elsewhere. I don't know if that's feasible, but in a wider sense, insomnia has had a big influence on the way I write, because I spend a lot of time wandering around the house at night, and I write at very odd hours of the day. I mean, I tend to do most of my writing between about 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the morning, whether I've slept or not. The kind of first draft stuff, which is what I consider to be the key sort of writing, the stuff that nobody likes doing, the stuff that they call shitty first draft writing, and the pleasurable bit, the rewrites, the editing and the revising, which I consider to be the pleasant part, can happen at any time of day. But certainly insomnia has been a struggle. I mean, there's a couple of excellent books that describe it. Marina Benjamin's book, Insomnia, and The Shapeless Unease by Samantha Harvey, both of them very recent books, with which I would coincide. And Sam Harvey says something very interesting about writing in relation to insomnia, and that's that we spend a lot of time, insomniacs, in this kind of twilight world. One of the ways that it was described to me was that there's a kind of tyranny of consciousness, because there's no kind of clear delineation between day and night. There's no way of really entering the day, because it's just a continuum. And what Sam Harvey says in her book was that for her, the classic idea of what writing is the conscious drawing on the unconscious, but she saw it as the other way around. It's the unconscious drawing on the conscious, and that's something which I very much identify with, and I think is particularly relevant probably to a novel like The Blue Tent. Okay.
We've got a question talking about sort of the conscious and the unconscious. Martin Coyle asks, he was struck by the Hitchcock-like air of menace in the novel. And he adds, I wondered whether the symbol of the blue tent was at once very ordinary but waiting to become meaningful. Is there, and I love the way that you set that up in the first few chapters of the book, by the way, like without actually saying, it's eerie or there's something wrong about it. It spells out very precisely what the character thinks is wrong about it, and the atmosphere sort of comes from that. But did you think of it as a suspenseful piece of writing, or?
Well, yes, and the suspense was partly mine, and I think it transfers into the writing because I didn't know what it was. And I like being in that state of uncertainty about my writing. And in fact, Borges, to return to Borges, who's behind me on the wall there.
Oh, hello, Borges.
Says that not being in a state of uncertainty is the ideal state of mind in which to write fiction. And I was aware of a sense of menace emanating from the blue tent, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. And I think that it bears directly upon the insomnia and the sense of uncertainty that brings with it. But I also think it's significant that the first character to emerge from the tent appears to be wholly benevolent, as if deflecting that expectation. And I didn't necessarily do that consciously, but I think it was a kind of, in answer to Martin's question, a sense of deflecting from that sense of imminent menace.
Okay.
And of course, the sense of menace does return, and it becomes a site for violence.
Okay. Okay, so the question, when the book talks about the running over of the dog being planned and connected to Alice, what did you mean by that?
Does it say that?
Someone thinks it does, and I believe I remember something about it. Possibly it. I mean, I would have read that and thought that this guy's quite paranoid, isn't he? But I don't know. Is there more to it than that? Is it just he needs to get a bit of rest?
I'm trying to.
It would have been early in the book, I think.
Yeah. No, I remember the incident, but I mean, who planned it? The dog. It's a bit reckless. Yeah. I'm going to have to come back to that, and someone's going to have to give me a page number.
I had sort of half a question about the fact that there's a dog and a fox.
Oh yeah.
Is there any sort of significance to having, you know, the wild and the tame version almost? Or
yeah, well, I mean, I kind of suspect that the dog isn't really a dog.
Yeah.
The fox is definitely a fox, but it's a talking fox, so hell. Yeah, I mean, there's always lots of animals in my writing. So the dog was originally a cat, actually, in the first few drafts.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and then I realized that the dog was somehow connected to Morgan, the old farmer, and it would have to be a dog. And also because I was reading about these dogs with two different colored eyes, like David Bowie in canine form, and thought I've got to get one of these in the book. So yeah, it was a dog.
Okay.
And is that your question, Colin, about the fox and the dog?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the wild and the tame, it's a kind of dichotomy, and I think it's probably quite a reasonable assumption that that's why it's there. Yeah.
It sort of reminded me of where I remember you mentioned in an interview with you that I'd read, you mentioned Tarkovsky. One of my favorite films is Stalker, and there's a dog in that seems to have some sort of unspoken, you know, like it's the guardian of some other world.
Yeah. No, I know this. The scene you mean, and yeah, it's a kind of ghost dog, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have another question. So this one's about the child. The other three characters are connected to Megan, but the child who appears towards the end of the novel doesn't seem to have any connection with her. The other three characters seem to show aspects of Megan's life, but the child doesn't fit with this. What is the purpose of the child's presence?
Yeah, a good question. The child, of course, is the narrator. So in a sense, it does have a direct connection with Megan, except it's not the narrator at the time. They're inhabiting different areas of space-time, as it were. It could be said that the entire collection of characters are within Megan's unconscious. She was a psychiatrist and a Jungian analyst from what we've read. She was taught by Mary Louise von France, who was one of the great authorities on alchemy and the Grail legend. So, there's a very strong possibility that the house represents Megan's unconscious, for example, if I were to go along that route.
Okay. Question from Lucy. She would like to know, if you had to have one of the visitors come and live with you, one would you choose and why? And I mean, I love this question. Thank you, Lucy.
Well, I suppose I've been living with them, well, I was living with them for quite a long time. So frankly, I wouldn't really want any of them. I'm going to go for the dog. Yeah, I've been thinking about getting another dog.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of dog would you get?
Well, I don't have any choice, do I?
Oh, okay. A talking dog that finds you. Yeah, gotcha. So Antonella has a question here, a couple of questions, I think. She says, thinking about this novel and your feelings as a writer who's Welsh by birth, but has been traveling and experienced the world for a long time, has the idea or feeling of hiraeth ever played a role in your writing? Hiraeth, for anyone not terribly connected with Wales who's watching, is a particularly Welsh concept of homesickness, isn't it? It's and is that something that you connect with?
Yes, but not specifically for not for anything in particular. I mean, it's a very abstract quality, isn't it? I mean, hiraeth for me isn't located in a longing or a nostalgia for for a particular place, and I tend to be, I've talked elsewhere about the notion of being a foreigner. It's an idea in the works of Alistair Reid, and I'm quite content being a foreigner. And sometimes I feel a foreigner in the place in which I was born. So hiraeth indicates a sense of belonging that I don't really feel. I mean, there are places I love, but it's interesting. Hiraeth is always used in relation to an especially Welsh connotation, and yet the Portuguese notion of saudade, which is, as far as I know, almost identical to hiraeth, and is, the kind of guiding emotion behind fado music, is similarly a longing for a sense of, for something that was lost, and is intrinsically tied up with place and home. So no, it's not a concept that takes up a lot of my attention.
Okay. She also wanted to know, she said, concerning your style, that she knows you're a translator. What would you recommend to someone who wanted to translate the first 3 chapters of The Blue Tent, which she says seem altogether as a single mysterious tale? What should this person pay attention to?
Wow, that's a very interesting question, because I happen to know that my French translator is in the audience. Yeah. So I would like to pass that on to her, but I know that I can't. I think that if I was translating the first couple of chapters, I would say the rhythm. Celine's just popped up. Yep, I'm here. I would say the rhythm, because the sentences, and it's probably not reflected in the way I read them, but it's advice that I would give to anybody, any translator. It's the single most important element of translation.
Okay. Okay, no, quite another question from Martin. He'd like to know, was the tent always blue?
Oh, absolutely. It couldn't have been anything else.
Why blue?
Why blue? Because blue is the color that connects white and black. Blue is the color, is the most radical color in alchemy, because it's the color that can't be found in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole alchemical process runs, through white, black, yellow, red, the four stages of the alchemical process. But the only glimpse that you might get of blue is in between the initial burning process between white and black. There's a whole literature on blue, as you probably know, and lots of writers have become obsessed with it.
Oh, I remember science lessons at school and getting the Bunsen burner on, and I'd never seen a blue flame before.
Yeah.
And yeah, there is something quite fascinating about it. A question about unreliable and unreliably unreliable narrators. It's from Anna. She says, he talks about unraveling a story in the blue tent. You already mentioned De Quincey, but are there any other writers who write with a sense of mystery or who present an unreliable narrator who've influenced you?
Oh gosh, where to begin?
Do you think of it? Because I was puzzled about this, and I did a little bit of reading about it. Can you give an example of an unreliable narrator in fiction that people would know and go, "Oh yeah, that's what it is"?
Of course, Humbert.
Okay.
Is an excellent example, and I would mention him because he's so well known. But the notion that that you can't unravel the exact extent of someone's untruths, because there has to be an edge of, I won't say psychosis, but there has to be an edge of imbalance there, that the person doing the narrating is unaware of their own unreliability. They have been consumed by the story that they're telling to the extent that they can't detach from it.
Okay, it's possibly like, I was thinking of people like Kazuo Ishiguro. The Remains of the Day. It's pretty, I think, an unreliable narrator. Like, he's so, self-deluded. But yeah. Okay.
But is he unreliable?
Well, he doesn't know he's unreliable. I guess the reader figures it out
does
pretty quickly, don't we?
Yeah.
Okay. What else do we have? Janice has come in. She has a general question, as she hasn't read it yet. Where she has read The Color of a Dog Running Away. Why do you think readers and writers are drawn to the magical and the mind-blowing? Is it a device to illuminate truths, or do we all just get pleasure from the experience of dislocation?
Well, it's a very good question, and I never set out to write a magical story. I simply had a story, and it turned into one which involved various elements of alternative realities, if you like. But I think we always want to engage with the notion that there's something beyond the everyday, that there's something beyond the expected or the drudgery of the same routines. And that does translate into magical occurrences. And of course it ties into a tradition that permeates our mythologies, doesn't it? The mythologies that we inherit in the mythologies that we adopt and turn into, and our lives become acclimatized to. And if you start thinking about fiction in this way and the unreal, then we couldn't really have had a greater sense of unreality than the one presented to us in the last 4 years by the American president.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't call it magical, but I'd call it a way in which truth is reconfigured, so that through various means, such as gaslighting and so on, the whole notion of real reality becomes twisted to the point that, and this is the intention, of course, that it's impossible to identify. So it's not just our literature which is permeated by this sense of unreality and fake news and the irrational, and the magical is an aspect of the irrational, isn't it? But it's the ordinariness of our lives which call it into being, and I think that's why we seek stories that undermine our conception of reality.
Okay. When you were writing it, I wanted to ask how difficult it was to overcome what would seem to me to be one of the problems that you have, which is they've all come out of this tent. It's the same tent. And all of the characters seem to just accept that, except for the narrator. Like how quickly did you hit on that as an idea, or was that difficult to kind of negotiate? Did you in early drafts, do they all fight over whose tent it is, I suppose, is the question?
No, it's apparent from the arrival of O'Halloran that Alice comes out and accepts the fact that his tent is the blue tent, and that it's of no great import whether it was hers or his. And of course the narrator's outraged because it seems such a fundamental issue for him of whose tent it is. But none of the characters, as you say, seem to pay the blindest bit of attention to it, which should be a clue, I suppose, to the fact that they're inhabiting a different sort of reality to him. And I think that this was, one of the intentions, that each switch of ownership, if you like, each occurrence, each tenancy of the tent that takes place, there's a shift in the dynamic between the characters. Most noticeably, a shift in the behavior and attitudes of the protagonist, but also of the other characters. It's as if it goes through some kind of quantum leap, and I think that was intentional. But it would have reduced the whole thing to a pretty banal scenario if they were all squabbling over whose tent it was.
I just remembered O'Halloran does get hit with a baseball bat, doesn't he, when he mistakenly
and it might be argued that he deserved it, but then the protagonist wasn't too upset. I mean, I think that could have gone either way as well. The protagonist has a very strange relationship with O'Halloran because, of course, in one reading of it, they're possibly all aspects of the protagonist's deranged imaginings. I mean, that is a reading that somebody's posited.
Is O'Halloran some sort of version of him that he would want to be, perhaps, like somebody who's living a more, like he's almost the opposite of the narrator, like he's this, where the narrator stays at home and writes guidebooks that's a place he's never been. O'Halloran's out living and doing, and is that part of the intention?
I'm sure that's the case, yeah, and there's a degree of envy which is almost apparent in the immediate dislike that he has, and and those quips that he has about going up to Morgan's farm for some fresh milk in the morning.
Okay.
He tries to belittle O'Halloran because he knows that he can never be O'Halloran.
Yeah. There's another question from Jamie, and I guess it's about awareness of your own intertextuality. He says, I love the fact that your novel contains a vagabond having a breakfast, and also that the narrator questions the colour of a dog running away. And he would like to know, how much did you chuckle putting that in?
Well, I guess the answer to that is that I'm only ever writing one book. And the characters that O'Halloran goes to the maze castration with are all characters that appear in The Colour of a Dog Running Away.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And two of them in Deep Hanging Out as well. Okay. So no, there's definitely a sense that you're only ever writing one book.
Okay. So I have another question from Antonella. She says she's about to start reading your collection Stowaway. And her question is, in Stowaway, what are the prose poems which represent you the most, or that being prose poems best express themselves in the microfiction genre?
Is that two questions?
I think it might be.
Which are the ones that represent me?
Yeah.
I've got absolutely no idea. I mean, it depends, what time of day it is and what I've had for breakfast. But I can answer the second one. Which ones are more like microfictions?
Yeah, which ones best express themselves in that particular genre or style?
Well, that would mean that there was a distinction between a prose poem and a microfiction, and I'm not going to accept that.
Okay. Why not?
Well, because it's a question of genre again, and I don't think the genre is really a very useful. I don't think the genre distinction between microfiction and prose poem is a very useful one. I would say that there are ones with more, overt narrative content, such as Earthquake, which could be presented as microfictions, but there are more reflective ones, such as The Days, which are certainly more prose poemy, but it's a gradient rather than a distinction. It's a continuum.
I mean, I always think, when I'm not doing things like this, I work in a library, and my kind of take on it is it's just a question of knowing which shelf you've put it on, really where to go in the bookshop. To find it.
Yeah. Well, it's a question of filing, isn't it? And there's a wonderful moment in the documentary about Max Siebold, Patience, where the publisher, Siebold's publisher, Christopher McElhose, is saying that when he submitted the manuscript for The Rings of Saturn, they had the discussion about what genre are we going to publish it under, and Siebold said, well, I want it under all the categories. Memoir, fiction, travel, history, and McElhose says, I can't remember whether he wanted Holocaust studies as well, but the whole range of different categories. And he said, well, we can't do that. You've got to pick two or three. And I think in the end, it's got fiction / memoir / travel. Well, that kind of would suit me down to the ground, because sometimes one feels limited by, there are so many great novels that one reads nowadays. One which I read recently was Juan Gabriel Vasquez, called The Shape of the Ruins, in which it's fiction, but he's a central character in it in a totally non-fiction-like guise, and he's telling a story of a murder that took place in 1948 in Colombia, which everybody knows about. So in what sense is it conceivably fiction? Well, and we have the non-fiction novel and the fictional autobiography. It makes your head spin. I mean, as Jeff Dyer would say, why can't we just have books?
Yeah. Yeah.
And he also says, fiction and non-fiction, they're bleeding into each other the whole time. Sometimes it's very difficult. Well, Borges, of course, had the answer to that, which is that everything's a fiction, whether you're talking about, a poem or a short story or a telephone directory or a bank statement. They're all fictions. And, I think that's quite a useful bucket to put them all in. Let's call it all fiction.
I think he's always got the answer, Borges.
Mm.
Let's see. A few more questions have come in. Let's see. James Lloyd would like to know, what is the relationship between your poetry and fiction? In the Stowaway collection, you adopt many personas and voices. Not sure how you'd put it. And there are overlaps with the Blue Tent. However, he's wondering how you conceive any connections between the two forms.
Now, that's quite an interesting proposition, that it hasn't occurred to me before, but the Stowaway is the most narrative collection of poems I've ever done. It's certainly got a distinct narrative arc to it, and it could conceivably, I'm now going to contradict everything I said before to Christie, it could conceivably have been presented as a novel. So it would have been a real headache to write. But I can see what he's saying. I think that probably because Stowaway was written over such a long period, an even longer period than the Blue Tent, and because some of those poems go back to the time that I was living in Greece and Turkey in my 20s, which is a hell of a long time ago. It never really presented itself in that narrative way until I put the bits together. And by then it was too late because they were already poems.
Okay. Next question is from Rianne. She'd like to know, is there something significant about 3:45 a.m. in the novel?
Yeah, there is. It's a really good question, because at the time that I was writing it, I was waking up every night at 3:45. So I decided to put it in the book.
Okay. Right, what else? Other questions do we have here? I think we might be running out of questions. So if anyone else does have anything they want to ask us, please do. We've got one from Caroline. She'd like to know, what do you most want the reader to take away after reading The Blue Tent?
Actually, the thing about writing a novel, but especially a novel of this kind, going back to Borges and that sense that the reader has the freedom to misread or misinterpret your book in any way she feels free to, and that is the wonder of writing fiction, is that it's open to any number of readings. And I'm not sure if Borges actually says misreading or misunderstanding, but the fact that he didn't believe that there was a correct way to read a book, that there wasn't a meaning which could be kind of sucked out of it and presented as this is what it's about, gives the reader that freedom and I think that the answer to the question is whatever is of value to you.
Okay. Yeah, Anna has added a question to the chat. She would like to ask about creative writing. And she'd like to know, what would you recommend to new writers starting out making creative fiction?
What
writing generally? Sorry.
What would I recommend them to read or to do?
To do, I guess. It doesn't say.
Well, write good sentences. I know it sounds too obvious for words, but it's like my mantra. Try to make beautiful sentences. You can't spend too long on a sentence. It can always be improved. And if you want a book about it, there's a book about making beautiful sentences by someone with a really long name. And it's called Several Short Sentences About Writing by Velin Klinkenberg. But it's good, you know. Focus on the sentence and you can't go wrong.
Okay, do we have any more questions coming in? Let me just have a quick look at the Q&A. I think, one's just come in. O'Halloran talks about arriving at the cafe, and I'd forgotten about this, just after he's found the Aleph. His friends all drive off to this cafe, and he stops and he goes to sleep, I think, doesn't he? And has this sort of long walk, and he arrives there before them all, with the aid of the Aleph. And the question is that going to feature in a sequel to the novel?
Not specifically, because as I see it at the moment, the next novel is likely to be from the point of view of Megan, but who's dead. But the story of O'Halloran arriving at the cafe earlier than his friends who leave before him is somehow related to the whole kind of time space notion, which is a kind of under theme, if you like, in the novel, and it's utterly inexplicable, and he ascribes it to the possession of the Aleph, of course, but it's actually something that happened to me in a very similar situation in the village of Saint-Mont, which is 5 kilometers from Riscle, and I arrived back at Riscle before my friends who left before me, and we couldn't work it out because they just got in a car, drove to Riscle, and I was already there. So I don't know what happened. Nobody ever explained it to me.
So it's realist fiction then, you know, you just...
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's lovely. I wondered, I mean, I know it's a silly question, but I mean, is the Aleph, why would someone want it? I think seems like a question that I was wondering. When I finished the book, like it seems like quite a horrifying thing to possess. Certainly, Aunt Megan was right that it didn't make her happy. And to give him a tent, she's kind of rescuing him from the Aleph, isn't she? Why is it a thing that people desire to have?
Yeah, well, I mean, she's just being a good psychotherapist. You know, that was her role. She could see it wasn't doing him any good, and one can only imagine that she had a more, you know, sober and restrained way of interacting with it. We don't know yet. But I fully agree. I mean, why would anyone want so much power? I mean, I think you pointed out the kind of likeness with Gollum and the Ring of Power. You know, it's something along those lines, isn't it?
Mm. Okay.
There's a couple more questions there, but I can't answer the first one because I've got no recollection whatsoever of wanting to ask Martin Amis anything.
Which question? Have I
Lloyd.
missed a question? Yeah, no, I have missed them.
Mm.
Yeah, so no memory of Martin Amis. Okay.
No.
Lucy.
Sorry, Lloyd.
Yeah, next time, Lloyd. Right, so how would you say that isolation affects the creative process?
Mm.
Do you think there's something in the isolation of either the individual or of an area that can inhibit or be a catalyst for creativity? I think that is an interesting question, because I think a lot of us are feeling very isolated at the moment, and feeling kind of that there are benefits and drawbacks. I mean, certainly I feel like, you know, not stimulated, but have a lot of time on my hands to read and write and think about stuff. But it's, what do you think?
Well, isolation, as opposed to loneliness, isolation as a voluntary state is possibly, you know, the only way in which to produce anything. I certainly think that, you know, in relation to this story, we might consider that the protagonist never received any of these visitors at all. And the whole thing is created out of his isolation. But I'm not sure what that tells us. But in terms of the creative process, it's a question of striking a happy balance, because people have different levels of the degree to which they can tolerate that degree of imposed isolation, and some people are quite content with it, and other people find it quite uncomfortable. I've always been quite happy with it.
Okay. A question from Nicola. Great sort of first word on the question, which is misreading, question mark. It seemed that the blue tent was the portal for the writer's uncontrollable imagination. You drag us into your blue tent, your imagined world, and make us believe the characters, and then makes them all disappear. They were just imaginary after all. Is that a misreading? Is that?
No. If that's a Nicola, I think it is. I'm pretty sure that she's nailed it. Yeah. No, it's very much to do with that, and certainly, as I said at the very beginning, it wasn't clear to me exactly what any of these things meant, and I had no idea what the blue tent was doing there, and I saw it as my task to find out, and that's probably why it took so long. But I certainly have a much better idea now of what it represents on a kind of wider cultural and interpretative meaning, range of meanings, because I realized that there was no single plot line or answer to the questions that it was asking.
It is an interesting ending. I mean, without wishing to give sort of too much away for anyone who hasn't finished the book yet, but I mean, I was, when I finished it and put the book down, I have to admit, rather dissatisfied. I felt like, you know, I liked these characters and they deserved a bit better, you know, but then since then I've gone back and sort of reread bits of it, and
can you imagine how I felt?
It is the kind of ending that makes you go back and look at it twice, you know?
Yeah.
How did you feel when you ended the book?
I felt a similar dissatisfaction, but I also knew that it was the right place to end, because I'd already decided that there would probably be more. and I wanted it hanging there so that these questions would make themselves, would arise as to whether or not it was a ghost story, whether they were figments of his imagination, whether we were talking about a multiverse or something of the kind, whether there was, it was a ghost story. Did I say that? And none of these things of their own accord seemed to be satisfactory, and yet I knew that it fitted into a larger story, and I just felt that was enough for the moment. And also there's peripheral characters who possibly could have had far bigger roles, because I always felt, partly from the kind of topography of the story, that Morgan was a very significant figure, because he can look down and see what's going on. I mean, in one deleted scene, he sees the protagonist come out and burn the entire library.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but it had to go.
Yeah. Why does he burn the library in this multiverse of? Is there
I guess it's driving him up the wall.
Yeah. Okay. I'm wondering if we've come to the end there. It's nearly 8:30. We have no more questions. Anna, did you want to come on and say good night just before I go? Thank you very much, Richard. It's been really fascinating to talk to you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, wow, what a great collection of questions we had. Some fascinating readings and such a fantastic discussion from Christie Collins and, of course, Richard, about the uncertainty and the menace in the novel, and reflections on the imagination and the influences on the novel too, which I was really interested in. Thank you for answering my question about that, Richard. Really taking us through a fascinating creative process today. So thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank all our audience tonight for joining us. Thank you for putting your questions in. We're really delighted to hear from you. Thank you to Christie for hosting the evening, and for Colin for hosting the excellent Q&A. And especially thank you to Richard for leading the event tonight and sharing his thoughts on his novel, The Blue Tent. I'm just going to say a few words about upcoming book talk events before you go this evening. We will also be sending you an email inviting you to submit feedback on tonight's event. So do let us know what you thought and how we can keep connecting with you in these strange and difficult times. So the next book talk event is on the 17th of February. You can register for that now, so quite soon. And that will be with the author Susan M. Gaines. And she will be talking about her new novel, Accidentals. She will also be talking alongside Martin Willis from the School of English at Cardiff University and Frank Haler from the School of Biosciences. There will be a discussion about the novel and its themes from the three speakers. Then on the 3rd of March, we have a book talk on Octavia Butler's Kindred. And we have three speakers joining us from the University of Bristol, Josie Gill, from the University of Delaware, Brittany Henry, and from Cardiff University, David Shackleton. So do also book your ticket for Octavia Butler's Kindred on the 3rd of March. Looking further ahead, there will also be events later this year on Anne Quinn's Passages. And also Tyler Keevil will lead another author-led event later in the year on his work, Your Still Beating Heart. In May, we'll be looking at Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, and in general her Cromwell series. So you may want to get reading on those if you haven't read them already. And in June, we'll be looking at To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf's classic text, as a summer special. That's enough from me, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope we can join in a virtual round of applause for all our speakers and everyone contributing. Especially thank you to Richard for an excellent, insightful interview. Thank you.